For unknown purposes, historians attribute the mass executions in the Ponar woods only to Polish Jews living in Lithuania and Poles. Yet in fact, according to Polish researchers of Nazi crimes, the Nazis executed captive soldiers and officers of the Red Army and Soviet citizens of Russian, Jewish, and Tatar nationalities in the Ponar forests. Well, several reasons motivated the selection of the woods as the site of the mass shootings. First and most important were the instructions of the General Directorate of Imperial Security in Berlin that the extermination sites should be located far away from large crowds of people so that the sound of gunfire could not be heard or echoed, and on the contrary should be located near easily accessible roadways so that victims could be quickly taken to the place of execution. And secondly, an important element was the deep pits prepared by Soviet units near Vilnius for storing aviation fuel for the nearby military airfield at Kazbiewice. The Nazis quite simply did not have to spend time preparing the extermination site, digging deep graves and fencing the area. The Nazi soldiers entered Vilnius on June 24, 1941, and the first detentions of the Jewish population began 2 days later, on June 26th. And on July 4th, only 10 days later, an execution took place in Ponar, hence only 10 days passed from the capture of the city to the first executions. Right after the occupation, in accordance with the policy of racial extermination pursued by the Nazis began the total extermination of the Poles, Belarusians, Russians, Jews, Karaites, and Tatars. It was the forests of Ponar near Vilnius that became the site of the mass executions of tens of thousands of people. The executions began in July of 1941, led by Dr. Alfred Filbert, head of the so-called Operational Unit No. 9. After the war, he was convinced of killing 6,800 people, released early in 1975, and died in West Berlin in 1990. Concerning the shootings of captured officers and Red Army soldiers, unfortunately, no information is available. Only the memories of Polish and Soviet Jews who miraculously escaped execution remain as documented evidence. As a rule, Poles and Jews were taken out of the city under the excuse of a so-called deportation. So for a long time, none of the potential victims even doubted that they were being taken out of Vilnius to either Poland or Germany. The diaries of Sekovich, found after the war, who buried them in bottles in the vegetable garden, also testify to this. Sekovich himself died in 1944. On the following day, July 12th, a Saturday, it is not known what actually happened. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a large group of Jews, about 300 people, was brought in. Most were intelligent, well-dressed, well-to-do people. They were carrying suitcases. An hour later, shots were heard. They were shooting in groups of 10. They were taking off their coats, hats, and worn-out shoes. They hadn't thought to take off their pants. The shootings continued on the next days, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th of July, Saturday. Usually, the executions took place in the mornings. Convicts were taken or transported to the Ponar forest, where they were waiting for execution in one of the dug pits. The shooters came to the pit through a ladder on which 10 to 12 people were taken up to the place of execution. In the first months of the mass executions, the selection was made on the basis of their gender. The women were taken to the nearest pine wood and the men to the collective pit. From the second half of 1941, everyone was taken randomly to one of the side T-shaped pits, which served as a waiting place for the executions. As recollections of the survivors show, the executioners were constantly in a state of severe alcohol intoxication. The execution took place according to the principle of a conveyor belt. The victims were taken from the pit, then they were sorted by sex and age, and then they were lined up in a column and taken to the place of execution, where there were several execution squads. The unfortunates were placed facing the pit and shot either in the back of the head or in the spine. Sometimes, grenades were thrown into the pit and prisoners were shot with machine guns. The most astonishing thing is that several of those shot were able to get out and make it to Vilnius, where they were treated in a hospital. The Nazis tried not to let anyone near the wounded so that the information about the mass executions would not leak out. But in spite of all their efforts, soon everyone in Vilnius knew that there were indeed no deportations and that there were firing pits in the Ponar woods. Here, one of the girls, who was pulled out by the survivors of the shooting, recounted. They had blindfolded us and placed us in a row at the edge of the pit, and when I asked her how she could see that it was the edge of the pit if she was blindfolded, she answered with slyness. I adjusted the rack so I could see. There were a lot of dead bodies in the pit, a whole mount of them. After Dr. Filbert's team was sent to Belarusia, the shootings were directed by Hauptscharführer Martin Weiss, who was called Black and White in Vilnius. Weiss was considered the master of the Ponary forests. The executioner was very keen on playing with his victims, so one Jewish girl who did not have time to sew a yellow star, the sign of a Jew, on her clothes, he personally protected her from the assaults of both Germans and Lithuanian nationalists, took the child by the hand through the city and even treated her with candy. And then, after everything, calmly and in cold blood, he shot the child in front of her parents. The recollections of Weiss' cases struck even the judges after the war with their cold-bloodedness and cynicism. For instance, while transporting prisoners from a wagon to the place of execution, one of the women fell down. According to the memories of eyewitnesses, Weiss stopped the convoy and lectured for 10 minutes on appropriate behavior. How could it be, gentlemen, that a woman stepping out of a carriage fell and no one supported her? Where are your manners, your gentlemanliness? After all, this woman could be a mother in the future. The executioner then gave the order to continue the path to the pit. From the year of 1943, when the situation at the front broke down, the Nazis began the mass destruction of the bodies of the executed to cover up the evidence of their horrible crimes. From the memories of prisoners who worked at the cremation, the rate was about 800 bodies daily, otherwise the worker was executed. By the way, the secrecy of the elimination of the bodies was at such a high level that an SS soldier who happened to wander in was shot on the spot and his body was also burned. In all, about 100,000 people were executed in the Ponary forests, of whom 70,000 were Jews, another 30,000 were Red Army POWs, Poles, Lithuanian soldiers, and Roma. Martin Weiss was sentenced to life imprisonment after the end of the war. Gestapo Detention Center in Belsk-Podlask. This prison, during the Nazi occupation in Belsk-Podlask, functioned under various names. Most often, it was called a Gestapo prison or a detention center. The detention center in Belsk-Podlask was established in August of 1941. It was initially located in a building on Mickiewicz Street. At the end of the summer of 1942, though, it was moved to Kolowska Street. The precise number of prisoners who passed through the detention center has not been determined. It is believed that there were about 1,000 in total. Prisoners were held for several hours to several months. Those who were lucky were sent to other prisons or concentration camps, but majority of prisoners were shot. Conditions were a lot worse than in the concentration death camps. The cells for prisoners were situated in the cellars, the first floor being occupied by Nazi guards. There were a total of 6 cells, at least one of which was for women. The largest cell was about 30 square meters in size, the others were significantly smaller. Up to 1944, there were no bunks or mattresses in the cells. The inmates slept on the concrete floor. Only one cell had a single bed. It was a so-called ill bed. The prison population consisted of civilians of different nationalities, Poles, Russians, and Belarusians. From the beginning of 1943 until the end of the occupation, the head of the prison was a German, Mosbach. There is no other information about him since just before its release, he went into hiding and the investigation was unable to locate him. During interrogations, prisoners were beaten, dogs were often set on them, and torture by starvation was constantly used, when inmates did not receive any food at all for several days or were fed with garbage. Sanitary conditions in the prison were also even worse than in the concentration camps. The absence of normal opportunities to go to the restroom and the constant filth and lice caused epidemics of infectious diseases. In 1944, for instance, typhus fever was prevalent among the inmates. Most of all, those prisoners were afraid of being dispatched, which could mean just 3 options: either another prison or a concentration camp or the Politska forest. Those who were sent to this forest never came back. Based on investigations conducted after the liberation of Poland, at least 643 prisoners were shot in this forest. The last execution was carried out a few hours before the town was liberated, on July 12, 1944. At the fence of the prison, 4 people were executed, a married couple and also a woman and a man, whose names have not been established. Thank you for watching, subscribe to X War History and leave a like.